Good evening, and welcome to the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen campus in Hong Kong for our first program of 2021. Tonight's program is entitled Cross Currents, Contemporary Art from New Delhi to Beijing. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen campus in Hong Kong, our premier location in Asia, representing UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. Tonight's program is a collaborative effort between the University of Chicago's Smart Museum in Chicago, as well as our UChicago centers in Beijing, New Delhi, and here at the Yuen campus in Hong Kong. Tonight, you can submit your questions through the questions and answer button. Tonight, we'll hear from 4 top experts in contemporary Asian art. Let me briefly introduce them. Carol Yinghua Lu is an art critic and curator, as well as a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Melbourne. In collaboration with artist Liu Ding, she is in the process of researching the legacy of socialist realism in the practice and historical narrative of contemporary art in China. Carol is contributing editor at Frieze, on the advisory board of The Exhibitionist, and was on the jury for the Golden Lion Award at the 2011 Venice Biennale. She also served as a co-artistic director of the 2012 Guangzhou Biennale and co-curator of the 7th Shenzhen Sculpture Biennale in 2012. From 2012 to 2015, she was the artistic director and chief curator at OCAT Shenzhen, and in 2013 was the first visiting fellow in the Asia Pacific Fellowship Program at the Tate Research Center. Carol is currently the director of Inside Out Art Museum in Beijing. Adele Tan received her PhD in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London, and is currently senior curator at National Gallery Singapore. Her research focuses on contemporary art in Southeast Asia and China, with a special interest in performative practices, photography, and new media. Her recent projects include exhibition Awakenings, Art in Society in Asia, 1960s to 1990s, the 2019 annual Ning Teng Feng Roof Garden Commission, and Outbound, a series of large specific artwork commissions at the gallery. She's curated other exhibitions at the gallery, which include A Fact Has No Appearance, Art Beyond the Object, 2016, and Yayoi Kusama, Life is the Heart of a Rainbow, 2017. Adele was formerly assistant editor at the British art journal Third Text, and her articles have appeared in numerous publications, exhibition catalogs, and journals, including PAJ, Broadsheet, Issue, Eyeline, and Third Text. Virangana Kumari Solanki is an independent curator and writer based in India. Her research interest lies in the manner in which interdisciplinary forms and art merge to create dialogues that travel from public spaces into private ones, the dissemination and varied interpretations of images across disciplines, and the structuring of curatorial research around artistic practices that expand the ideas of medium specificity through narrative and storytelling. Her curatorial discourse has primarily focused on art practices within the extended South Asian context. She was the 2019 Brooks International Research Fellow at Tate Modern in the Curatorial and Photography Department and a resident at the Delfina Foundation. Our moderator for this evening is Oriana Cachon, curator of global contemporary art at the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago. Her curatorial practice is committed to expanding the canon of contemporary art to respond to the global circulations of art and ideas. At the Smart Museum, Oriana curated the exhibitions The Allure of Matter, Material Art in China, with UChicago's esteemed art historian Wu Hong, Samson Young, Silver Moon or Golden Star, Which Will You Buy of Me? And Tang Chang, The Painting That Is Painted with Poetry is Profoundly Beautiful, the first solo presentation of that pioneering abstract artist's work outside of Thailand. At the Art Institute of Chicago, Oriana organized Zhang Pei Li Record Repeat, the first major presentation of the Chinese video artist at the American Museum. She is currently conducting new research for an exhibition that explores major transnational shifts in art making since the 1970s. A specialist in contemporary Chinese art, Oriana holds a PhD in art history, theory, and criticism from the University of California, San Diego. Oriana, I'll turn the stage over to you to share your initial comments and get us started.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm so excited to be able to bring these three esteemed curators together today and to help connect the Smart Museum to the University of Chicago's centers in Delhi, Beijing, and the UN campus in Hong Kong. The Smart Museum's mission is to open the world through art and ideas. And as the museum's first curator of global contemporary art, I've been honored to curate exhibitions that showcase pressing issues from around the Pacific Rim to our audiences in Chicago. In the last 3 years, I have looked at early developments of abstraction to sound art and world's fairs, and most recently, material art from China. At the same time, I've been able to engage the international scope of the University of Chicago, collaborating across our global centers and campuses to work with artists, scholars, and curators, and to share the SMARTS exhibitions and research with local audiences. However, tonight's program is especially exciting because I have the pleasure of showcasing the dynamic work of curators across Asia to talk not just about their recent projects and the impacts of COVID on their practices, but I hope, and perhaps more importantly, about what it means to curate across a region, how that is different from the ways in which we think about the so-called global contemporary art, and how a renewed focus on the local and the regional might animate the post-COVID art world. With these questions in mind, we will start the evening with short presentation by Carol, Adele, and Varangana that will be followed by a discussion. I encourage you to send any questions that you might have throughout the event using the Q&A function so that we can intersperse them into our discussion. And so I will hand it over to Carol to start us off.
Good evening. Thank you, Oriana, for the invitation to speak today. First of all, Happy Year of Ox from Beijing. I want to take this opportunity to share with you a couple of projects I have conceived in relation to understanding Asia in the past few years. So personally, Asia as a context for practice has become more prominent for me after I was appointed one of the 6 co-curators for the Guangzhou Biennale in 2012. Throughout the process of working with 5 other curators from different parts of Asia, I came to realize how little we as Asian practitioners were interested in Asia. We were not just indifferent to the specific experiences and practices in our Asian neighbors. We were also ignorant about our own regional and national histories and their interconnections. We were all very busy looking towards the West in general as a universal model of advanced contemporary art practice to emulate. This problematic somehow became impetuses for some of my following work. For instance, from 2014, I joined Kim Sam-jung from Seoul, Yuki Kamiya from Hiroshima, and Huang Qianhong from Taipei in conceiving a research exhibition entitled Discordant Harmony. It responded critically to the notion of harmony as an ascription for a stereotyped and reductionist notion of Asia as a unity. In this project, which lasted several years, 4 curators and all involved artists try hard not to claim what is Asia, but to make Asia a critical question in the artist's practices. As the exhibition toured to each of our respective cities, each episode addressed specific issues raised by its context. In the last exhibition at the Inside Our Art Museum, we focused on social and artistic turns in the region from the 1980s to the 1990s, while contemporary art in these four regions have their own development tracks and historical context. With the background of globalization and the rapid rise of neoliberalism at the turn of the 1990s, they all experienced profound transitions in aspects from artistic works to art system construction. The paradigm and framework produced by this transition period continue to be present for more than 20 years, constantly defining and shaping the boundary and practice of artistic work, exhibition, art history writing, and art institutions. Through the investigation of cases of specific exhibitions and artist practices in the late 1980s to the early 1990s, we could see that artistic practices, thinking, and historical contexts in East Asia have been closely related to each other. In recent years, I myself have carried out a series of studies with artist Liu Ding on the history of Chinese contemporary art. It is a widespread idea that Chinese contemporary art had been underpinned by an avant-garde history made up of individuals' innovations pitted against institutions, academies, and the state. This rhetoric is as much as how generations of modernists, postmodernists, and contemporary art historians have theorized and explained Western European and North American art. Yet as artists and curators working within China, Liu Ding and I have long realized the limitations of such frameworks in interpreting artistic works, individual positions, and experiences here. Through revisiting a certain historical period or an individual artist's practice, we explore the ideological roots of cultural subjectivity and gradually establish a historical vision of understanding today's art practices and views by linking the history of art to the history of ideas in China. In our latest research, we regard 1987 as a time marker to distinguish the art history of China to the mid to late 1980s and curated this exhibition that I'm presenting here, Waves and Echoes, which presented varied layers of artistic works and thoughts around 1987. Next slide, please. The year of 1987 was a turning point when the liberal condition of the post-cultural revolution came to an end. Economic space would be gradually emerging in the place of any political or cultural spaces for art after 1987. One of the aspects of the show looks at a selection of anti-art, anti-cultural, and Dadaist art projects emerging in 1986 under the influence of postmodernist thoughts introduced into China in the beginning of the 1980s, first in the fields of architecture and literature. Next slide, please. Artists caught up with it in the mid-1980s. They made use of the intense and extreme forms or concepts to explore on the edge of art, challenging all kinds of eclecticism and incomplete study of Western modernity. It responded to and continued the leftist literal ideal in the early 20th century, as well as repeatedly delayed the formation of art, rules, and systems in China. Next slide, please. Judging from the artistic practices of South Korea in the same period, this trend we discover was not just happening in China, but in other parts of the world simultaneously in response to the widespread of postmodernist thoughts. We are currently expanding the scope of research to survey the influence of postmodernist thoughts on art across different parts of the world. Next slide, please. And next. Due to the time constraint, I won't be able to go into further details about the exhibition. But as Corianna was mentioning, the post-COVID challenge has brought us a lot of difficulties in terms of conducting research in a further kind of expanded view. But we are trying to connect these different parts of regions in Asia and hopefully in other parts of the world through such a research to look at simultaneously in around the period of 1980s, especially around 1987, what were the artistic movements that were taking place at that time. My share will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carol. We're going to hand it over to Adele.
Thanks, Carol, for your really illuminating presentation. I'm going to take a slightly different turn, which is that mine's going to be far more prosaic. And it reflects on the period of time where the museum, the National Gallery Singapore, have had to contend with the challenges that kind of COVID brought and wrought upon us. So the first project that, I did, next slide, has to do with something that, was far more related to bringing art to the people, pardon for the cliche, but it was also important to start to think about how art history could be brought down and made relatable to the every man, in Singapore, whilst we couldn't get anywhere outside of the country. So it also coincided with the 5th anniversary of the gallery, because we opened in 2015. And so the idea was that we wanted to find something that, connected with the Singaporeans, and to find a way to use the works of art in our collection to kind of spin a story and bring, different insights via literature. So we have also invited a writer, Shamini Flint, who is actually Malaysian, but based in Singapore. And she developed a script that also interwove excerpts of poetry from Singapore poets. Next slide. This is a small trailer, just to give you a sense of what the project is.
Singaporeans really love their food. In my family, there's an ongoing debate about which aunt cooks the best biryani. To me, food is a taste of home, memories on a plate, and stories of a nation. I'm Shamini Flint, writer, lover of fine food, and an art enthusiast. Join me as I explore how art and daily life in Singapore has evolved through a subject that connects Singaporeans across all walks of life: food.
So as maybe some of you might know, Singapore has also received recognition for its kind of hawker culture last year as a kind of UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. So this kind of is opportunistic in a certain way, because we're also playing up the centrality of feeding ourselves and then connecting it to images of food that also are able to tell a story of how Singapore developed. And talking about Singapore's development in history through images, we were also on this kind of rush to find ways to speak more about ourselves and connect that history via digital means. So the next project is Stories and Light for Modern Photographers in Singapore But this is the kind of first foray that the gallery did via a digital medium. So this is a virtual exhibition that we devised in 2020. And next slide. And so we were using this kind of novel platform for us to very quickly showcase, well, photographic medium is of course something that is very amenable to being transported and shown on a computer screen. So we used this exhibition in order to showcase 4 modern photographers, Lee Sao Lim, Li Lim, Lim Kwang Ling, and Tan Lip Sing, who were all influential members of early photographic clubs in Singapore of the 50s and 60s. But their images were also useful in terms of capturing and encapsulating the formative histories of Singapore. So in here, this slide, you will see 2 workers that show the Samsu women, but also the technological or rather technique that Tan Lip Sing has brought to the language of photography, using, you know, different, almost lurid color palette to kind of make an almost estrange this familiar picture of nation building in Singapore. And next slide. So one of the more important programs that the gallery did in 2020 was this series of exhibitions that we helped to kind of put out, which is Proposals for Novel Ways of Being. So instead of seeing the gallery as a kind of locus of things that happen in it, we decided that we will help to enable other people to put out their exhibitions. But also it came at a point where we were finding, or rather trying to find ways to enable curators and artists to also be able to have some sustenance, you know, other resources to keep their practices going. And in fact, so we had this rather creative idea of, you know, making this constellation of different institution and art spaces, and then supporting them with, you know, funding for projects that they will propose. And one of the most interesting projects, because part of the day's discussion is also about regionality. Next slide, please. Is this project called In Our Best Interests, currently on at the ADM Gallery at NTU. So this is actually quite remarkable because all of the other exhibitions under the banner of Proposals for New Ways of Being spoke more to the local context, to local artists, and were much more formally inclined. But here in this exhibition that is curated by Kathleen Ditzik and Carlos Cuizon, they were seizing upon a historical moment and using art to kind of investigate and interrogate, you know, the complexities of this moment of a post-war and Cold War context in the region of Southeast Asia, but also connecting it with the politics of the Cold War and its kind of inflections with the African nations, and also the politics of race embedded with American Cold War politics, as it were. Yeah. So we can speak more about this later in our conversation, but I'll hand it over to Oriana.
Thanks so much, Adele. And we're going to now ask Rangana for her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Ariana, for inviting me to be on this panel with Carol and Adele, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus more on how the past year has been instrumental in rethinking curatorial approaches and how in the process of physically slowing down, there's been a parallel gear shift in picking up the pace at which we have had to learn new skills and innovate not just methods of communication, but also ideas of putting across projects and presenting artists' works. So I was at a moment of pause when the lockdown was imposed in India last March. And I was just beginning. And soon after that, we are going to start the summer residency at Space Studio Baroda, which I was programming for at that time. And the first thing that we had to think about was how to adapt to the idea of an online mentorship, which became something that we ended up doing through the past year, where it was artist reviews, but also learning so much about each other's practices. And this extended from just not just India, but also to the region, where it led to reading groups with the Nepal Picture Library and really thinking through what archives were and so much more, which otherwise may have only happened in a physical space, or we would have only had to attend lectures or film festivals. And I'm sure most of us at the beginning were just on everything that we possibly wouldn't have had access to. But once Zoom fatigue crawled in, that started getting filtered as well. And parallel to all of this, I started thinking through an exhibition for the Serendipity Arts Festival, which takes place in Goa every year in December. And of course, in April, we were still talking about the idea of what the physical exhibition was going to be. But by June or July, we realized that this wasn't going to happen. And there was this thinking exercise of what it meant to curate an online exhibition that would be different from just a viewing room or a series of images that one could click through and still engage an audience. And for the Serendipity Arts Festival, we were looking at the larger South Asian region. So it wasn't about just Indian artists, but at the same time, it wasn't about defining borders and nations, but more about looking at artistic practice, which is also the core of how my curatorial practice works, where it's how looking at how artists' works engage with an audience and what are the dialogues that are moving to audiences and back into private spaces from public spaces itself. So when we started thinking about future landing, the idea was to create a model that takes on a life of its own, where each artist, even today, has complete control over the back ends of their works and the pages. And we devised this drip system, which is where each artist decides whom they want to pass on their space to. So it works in the form of a virtual studio. When I approached these 5 artists to think about what they wanted to do, the core of the proposal was to think of time, experience, storytelling, and constant change, but keeping the future in mind as an arrival point. It was challenging initially, and though I came on board as the curator for Future Landing, it was really built on what we decided to call the foundation team, and which included 3 web developers, the designer, 5 of the artists, because each one was engaged in how we designed the entire website. Could you play the video as well, please? I've taken a screenshot of the video, but it's really not the same as experiencing it, because the only way that one can experience this website or any of the artworks is by engaging with it quite actively. So there was no way of passively looking at it or just going through it while you're doing something else. So it demands your attention. So this is Farah Mullah's work, where you need to interact and speak to your screen to see how the image will change. There's a link in the chat box, so I'd encourage all of you to go to that link and experience this website for yourself. This is a work by Abhinay Koparazi, where if it depends on how many people are on the website when you are interacting with it, and it picks up sounds from your location. And Abhinay has created various compositions and designs that then take over your screen. So every time you go back, you will experience a different way of interacting with it. This is by game developers. They're a pair by Studio Olio Mingus. And they will be adding to this as they develop more games, but it also talks about the linearity of time and questions the narratives of history. There were two image-based artists whom we worked with. This was the Nepal Picture Library. So they've right now put up Dalit, A Quest for Dignity, the archive, which they have. And this archive will change with time as well as the year progresses. But what it allows you to do is interact with the archive and create your own storyboards. So it's also about thinking of what the future readings of archives can be and how we think of archives based on our own histories. The packet is a collective based in Sri Lanka, and they work with images of the internet. And the way they've juxtaposed images with the text at the bottom is something which again challenges how we think through images and how the context changes. And again, like I mentioned, every time you go back, you'll have a different experience. But also while looking at all, if there's something else that came to mind was, though these were all from the South Asian region, they also speak to a much larger global audience. And the thoughts that, I mean, moving into the future, the thoughts that come in about how are we going to continue looking at virtual programming and whether this fatigue of screens and the internet is something that we continue to address, but also in relation to sustainable curating and what that means when we've all had to go through this in the past year and rethink modules of moving forward. And I look forward to discussing that with the rest of you through the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we're going to bring all of our speakers back together. I think those presentations really provide exciting overlaps and moments to connect. And I will say, I think what really struck me listening to all of the presentations was the very different ways that each of you is responding to this moment, but also to responding specifically to the needs of your local contexts. And the notion that Carol brought up of a discordant harmony feels very apt as we start to think about the region and sort of regional responses to COVID, but also, as Virangana mentioned, how we start to think about moving forward and perhaps what are some of the practices that we hope that we can begin to carry forward. And so with that in mind, I actually want to ask Adele to start off to talk a little bit more about your experiences curating regionally and how those perhaps have impacted or not impacted at all what you've thought about now in this moment and how you're thinking about moving forward. And then we'll open that up to all of the panelists.
Thanks, Oriana, for the question. So it is a really challenging moment in terms of the, travel being curtailed and our relationships somewhat, having this moment of caesura, right? Not being able to be face to face with people. There's a kind of, I guess, emotional connection where you do get to be visiting artist studios and being with them. But I think it's a funny moment for me working in a large national art institution, where this has been a moment of also shifting gears and trying to make sense of actually our own art history first, and then trying to place our own art history within a larger regional context. And in fact, the pressures now on us are, in fact, to try and do more for our own artists. I think in an initial opening period, when the museum opened, there was this great ambition to be you know, kind of a receptacle of sorts for, you know, Southeast Asian art history and its artists, with also made forays to try and connect our histories regionally with East Asia as well. But we've now come to a kind of a strange small turning point where we are now also wanting to invest more knowledge in the same way, I guess, with Carol's projects, and she wanted to know much more about, you know, contemporary Chinese artists, you know, and using that pivotal moment of 1987. So we're also trying to understand where all our pivotal moments are with all the artists in Singapore, a small island that we may be, right? But we're trying to use this moment, not for navel gazing necessarily, but to now come more prepared to discuss our artists in greater depth and with greater critical acuity. Yeah. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question about going, working regionally. So the regional aspects of the museum haven't been kind of diminished in a way. Yeah, we're just kind of perhaps shifting our gears and refocusing a little bit so that we can make more precise connections between our own artists' practice with what was going on in the region. So it's a kind of moment of self-knowledge, as it were.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Carol, that also seems like it relates very deeply to your ongoing practice, which has been very much focused on reconceptualizing histories of contemporary Chinese art. And this has been really an ongoing engagement for you. This is not something that was brought on by the pandemic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, one of the kind of urgency that we have been feeling for years, even way before the pandemic happened, and the kind of antagonism among different countries that are emerging from this pandemic. For people who work in China, there's a very strong kind of anxiety about self-definition. How do we perceive, how do we understand our own kind of practices and experiences? Because since the 1980s, the kind of historical narrative and the perception of practices in China have been very much framed by concepts, theories that have been learned from the West, North America, West Europe in particular. Rarely there have been strong focuses or awareness of looking at specific experiences and individual experiences in the country. So this kind of anxiety to describe and understand ourselves has been a driving force for a lot of my work, and also the programming at the museum since I joined the Inside Art Museum in 2017. So I continue to do that, but I'm also very aware that this kind of engagement with self-understanding has the danger of a nationalist kind of risk. So I'm very conscious of constantly looking at ourselves while in dialogue with colleagues in other parts of Asia, looking at dynamics and movements in other parts of Asia, and at my best effort also to expand it to other parts of the world. But that's also a very kind of ambitious plan. It takes time to evolve as well. But I think the pandemic really makes this kind of critical understanding of ourselves even more urgent, I would say.
Thanks so much, Carol. Farangan, I'm going to pass it to you. And then I will also say we're starting to have a lot of audience questions coming in. So we'll we'll ask a bit, Virangana, if you can talk a little bit more about the local. And I was really interested in reading groups in the archives and sort of the types of knowledge that the pandemic enabled you to go back to.
I think one of the things is about creating networks of people and practices, because otherwise we are so isolated in the way we work, or we're just moving from project to project. But here it was about coming back and regrouping with people, with a language that we were all keen to explore further. And in recognizing the situatedness of artists within the larger curatorial dialogue and frameworks, as well with the projects that we're working on, was to understand the personal histories and in a way bring to the forefront artistic practices as alongside curatorial practice as well. And one of the things was, when we think about expanding regional boundaries, there was also a shift from just personal narratives and archives to then look at the broader way in which the outside was looking at a region. But then I started thinking about how important it was just to start listening. And when working with regions, what the importance of the audience was when you address the local. So while we were looking at a broader context, it also came down to engaging with the narratives that we were trying to address, who we were addressing these to, and the importance of engagement that came with all of this, and how important the public dialogue was, and how it came into the private and vice versa.
Thank you so much. One of the questions that we got online is, to what extent will art be showcased virtually in a post-COVID world? How will the process of art exhibitions be changed as we move forward? I think this is something that I know that I've been doing a lot of thinking around.
I was just going to say, there's been so much around the AR and VR which has come about, but it's also to think about how long that's going to last for, because the pace at which technology keeps moving, it's not too long before something gets old.
But I also wonder too about the sort of sluggishness of institutions. I think, museums have tended not to be the quickest places to respond or to integrate new technologies. And so is this a moment where we need to start thinking about moving faster as we go forward into the post-COVID world? Or is this a moment where we take the lessons of slowing down and reconsidering and reconceptualizing pace, which I know is a conversation we've had a lot at the SMART. I guess, right, how do you continue to stay relevant in a world where the technologies around you are constantly changing?
Well, that's the perennial paradox, right? Because museums, because I work in a very large one, we're like dinosaurs, can't run as fast as the technology goes. Yeah, but I mean, we try. So at the museum, we do, or rather at the gallery, we do have an innovation lab called Co-Lab. We also have tried to find ways to have a robot that is, acting in place of a docent, being able to bring visitors around, give them the information as if it were the human docent. We also devised kind of a Facebook based chatbot of sorts, so you can ask it questions with regards to the exhibition. So these are kind of workarounds, but they don't supplant the traditional exhibition in that sense. But we have been lucky because, well, Singapore has had it somewhat under control. We're not in any of a kind of a lockdown where people can't go out. So people in Singapore can still go to the museums, be in a physical setting. So at the gallery, we have this quite an ugly term that we've kind of coined. It's called phygital, like physical plus digital, right? But it kind of points to the same thing. You want this blended reality of both the actual exhibition plus a kind of digital addendum where you can go and revisit the exhibition once you're out of it and perhaps get supplementary information or be engaged in another type of conversation or debate somewhere else online in the ether. But I just want to say that at the museum, the ambition to put out the exhibitions has not ceased. Like to have people physically walking through the space is really important, because you need to encounter objects and encounter objects in space, and how you encounter that will tremendously affect how, you know, the narratives are imprinted in you as a visitor. And the digital experience will come in as another layer. It will speak to you in a different way, but we're trying to make that not have become a kind of schizophrenic experience, so to speak. Yeah.
That seems to be one of the ongoing points of discussion and debate at the SMART, is this insistence of the primacy or the centrality of objects and viewing objects in space. And I will say, the sort of art history geek in me, that's one of the things that I've always loved the most about going to the Inside Out Museum, Carol, because I think your particular focus on bringing out objects from the 80s and from the 90s in China is so important, especially in this moment, because I think a lot of times those objects and those histories have been elided over and sort of by a grand narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, on one hand, the museum in Beijing has been quite lucky in the way, because we have been able to open the museum as usual since the end of April. And so we did not kind of have to come up with alternative ways for audience to engage with what's being shown in the museum virtually. But we have realized, or I have realized throughout the kind of explosive moments of the pandemic, was that it was, to a great extent, there was a great battle over discourses, the kind of rhetorics put out by the government and the kind of rhetorics that circulated in the air created a lot of confusion, but also created a lot of conflicts among different groups of people. And so I felt that actually at this moment, it's more important to kind of work on discourses than on attracting or getting attention. So we have, since May, we have spent a lot of time kind of trying to start a campaign on creating a discourse for more serious art in China. This also is due to the fact that in the last year, China experienced a very unusually prosperous commercial kind of moment for art internally. But the fact that many people cannot travel and could not go to international exhibitions and art fairs, in turn propelled a booming internal art market in China. And that created a lot of positive energy, or kind of pride even among Chinese practitioners. And there was a kind of complacency with just putting up popular shows and presenting commercially viable art. And I felt that it's very important now to kind of try to protect a space for serious art. And so we have spent a lot of time creating writings to educate and to inform the public about art history, about the actual artwork, the practices and thinking processes of artists, to kind of review other kinds of art than just commercial or kind of very popular appeals in art.
I think that's a really good segue to the next question about silver linings. And I think, especially the art market boom, I think in China was one of the unexpected outcomes, but there have been a lot of unexpected outcomes throughout the pandemic, and also ways, I think, of refocusing. And well, I think just right, the way of refocusing on the local, finding new ways of engaging our local audiences, I think is one of those major sort of silver linings. But Adele Virangana, I'm wondering if there's others that you see as well.
I think in terms of the silver lining, one if it's been a lot about discovery through this lockdown, because the number of artists and people whom I've met, I mean, just even though it's been through a screen, but there's been so many younger practitioners who I don't think I would have encountered if it hadn't been for various platforms. I mean, there was Art Chain India that set up review chains. There were other artists who just reached out via social media, were introduced via other younger artists. So, and I don't think we would have had the time or taken the time to pause, because you would have the excuse of a physical studio visit. And I think that's been one of the major things I've taken away from this past year, especially just about new connections and people.
So, well, one of the more important silver linings for me is that people stop traveling and, contributing to an ever enlarging carbon footprint, because I think the past year has been a year of reckoning with, how a museum is going to be sustainable in the long term. So the ecological dimension comes into the frame now, about how much resources every exhibition consumes. So there's this now rethinking about, and also because many shows that were on the calendar have started to be cancelled. And I think that was also a moment for us to think about the practicalities of having these long haul truckings of art moving around the world to different spots. And that's also where I think digital platforms could come in to play a really kind of crucial role. And because the digital platform has this tremendous global mobility and ability to go viral very quickly for good reasons or bad reasons, I think it also increases our ability to respond much more quickly if the museum wants to put out a position on something. So for instance, I mean, now we have the coup going on in Myanmar. So, I mean, the policy, obviously in ASEAN is non-interference. We are quite careful and sensitive about this, but there's nothing stopping us from trying to show solidarity by simply also putting the art of, Myanmarese artists out on our social media, giving them visibility, in another realm. Yeah. So that's also something that we're thinking about, and kind of usefully using these digital tools to bring together and make visible other sorts of communities. Yeah. And also, I think we have, I think a cohort of younger, museum goers, right, that are wanting to be embraced by, well, at least for the National Gallery, right, because we deal with the modern more than the contemporary. And so there's often a sense that, maybe we look too forbidding. So there's this need now to start to bring ourselves down and trying to listen more, as Virangana mentioned earlier. Yeah. So these demographics will need to be unfolded in.
I was listening to a podcast yesterday with the director of the Portland Art Museum, who was talking about his museum's local focus and how he got to a point where he was getting really tired of going to museums and seeing the same artists. And so I think we're underscoring this push away from sort of the global homogeneity of the sort of rock star blockbuster artists. But Adele, what you were talking about visibility and also the way art is responding or can, and especially institutions can respond to political institutions, actually references back to one of our earlier questions, specifically around frictions with the government, and sort of how artists are able to communicate concerns around social issues and environment and inequality and human rights. I'm wondering, Virgana and Carol, if you'd be willing to speak a little bit about how artists right now are responding to social issues or institutions.
In India, it's been, I mean, it's I think a personal choice which artists make if they want to respond to social issues, because not all of them address that through their practice. But for those who do, there's been a lot of response to the current protests that are happening in the country. I mean, there've been multiple protests, whether it's been the CA or the farmers' protest, but it's also how they use their artistic language to use those as tools to respond to what's happening in political contexts. And that's, I think, happened over, I mean, it's not only again in India, but it's happened over the years, where very often that becomes an outlet of commenting on something where there can be repression, where there have been questions on how people are engaging with just the news media itself.
Well, in China, since 2012, we have been living in a very tightly controlled context, which makes openly and critically addressing political and social issues is nearly impossible. And I think at the moment, there are artists, practitioners who are still very much socially concerned and minded, but we need new ways. We need methods to address these issues, maybe not directly, but through other means. And this has not yet been able to be seen openly. But I think it doesn't mean that it's not happening. It doesn't mean that artists are not socially minded, or that there are attempts to express, address social issues. It's just at this moment where we are is nearly impossible. So for instance, some of us turn to historical periods, historical positions to understand why we have arrived at where we are today. It's not directly criticism of the present, but by looking at the history, there are ways to create metaphors or create new ways to address the present.
Thank you. And then as we're sort of going to start wrapping up, I have one last question, and it's about how do we increase visibility? And instead of asking about how we increase visibility, I actually want to ask you if you could give some concrete ways that we can gain access to perhaps underrepresented artists. And so I'm based in Chicago. The sun is finally coming up this morning. I know that we have audience members from across the world. And so if we want to learn more, so instead of putting the sort of onus of responsibility on the curator or the institution, how can all of us start finding and accessing artists who have perhaps lacked visibility in the past?
I was just clarifying whether this is a kind of collective question, like we respond individually as also consumers of, these histories ourselves.
Yeah, I think so.
I just feel that actually there is a lot of ignorance among art critics and curators of art history. And such an ignorance leads to omissions of artistic practices, or a better or more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of artistic positions. So I think learning more about art history is a very important step towards kind of opening up our horizons about possibilities of artistic practices.
Thanks, Carol.
I guess just to follow on from Carol's point is also that perhaps us as curators, generators of these sorts of also research and discourses, scholarship, I find myself needing to also overcome a certain level of anxiety of maybe say, for instance, like the artists that I am working on or passionate about, and they perhaps are not so known elsewhere beyond a certain kind of sphere. It's trying to get over a certain hurdle that maybe that the audience that I'm speaking about will not have any interest, and just kind of do it and talk about them more often. And this responds to this question of visibility. No one's going to do it until you do it, right? So instead of kind of, I guess, second guessing, the importance of the artists that we are, researching about in our own work areas or projects. Yeah, I think there is a certain amount of just stepping up and putting it out there. Yeah, and then also with a lot of tools at our disposal at this moment, we, are not short of avenues, I think, to put research out, except that it is a very crowded field, and we sometimes don't know where to look. I mean, even I, as a consumer of art historical discourses, it's not often so easy to kind of wade through a lot of what is out there. And so making, I guess, these networks intense again and dense again, yeah, is really quite critical. And I perhaps am a bit guilty of not maintaining that. I've maintained it in the kind of analog realm. Maybe, in this kind of COVID world where we are really reliant on, kind of online communications. Yeah, we need to talk much more. So I need to talk to you more, Oriana, across the pond.
I'm
excited.
excited.
And to Carol and to Viragana as well. Yeah.
I mean, just as a closing remark, I think so much of what Adele, what you said about this idea of knowledge sharing is so important, because when it comes to learning about other practices, while you may reach out and look at platforms where you respond to somebody's work, there's so much that you end up absorbing from other artists or other practitioners that you speak to about who they are inspired by. And sometimes it's artists you may never have come across otherwise. And unless we expand this idea of knowledge sharing and are very open about sharing our resources as well, that's how I think this would expand further and faster as well.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak with the three of you today. And I hope we can continue this conversation virtually and at some point, perhaps in person in the coming years. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Lenny Chidori, the director of our Delhi Center, for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Oriana. So on behalf of the University of Chicago Global Centers in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Delhi, I would first of all like to thank Oriana for conceptualizing and curating such a wonderful webinar. So very relevant, so very contemporary, and so very interdisciplinary. Thank you so much for that. And our gratitude to all the speakers for your enlightening presentation. The discussion couldn't have been as rich as this without your contributions. So a big thank you on behalf of all of us. Some of you may know that this is the third collaborative event by the Global Center. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Mark, Zenning, and their team members, and my team members in Delhi too, for contributing to this webinar in many different ways. And I look forward to many more such collaborative events in the future. Last but not the least, the most important people who have made this discussion possible are the audience, the participants. A big thank you to you for your questions. You have indeed contributed to making this discussion more lively. So, ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you. Stay tuned to know more about many more interesting events that are coming your way. So thank you very much. And I would like to close by Thanking all the organizers, thanking all the speakers and the participants for making this webinar as rich as this. Big thank you.